Thank you both that you take the time to talk to us and to our students. Before we start discussing your book, which we now use a lot in our lectures, I'd like to briefly introduce Mark and Josh. Mark Johnson is founder of Innosight, the company that he founded, among others, with Clayton Christensen. And he, for example, consulted the Singapore government on innovation and entrepreneurship. Josh Suskewicz is partner at Innosight with a focus on clean tech and other healthcare topics. Both have written articles for the Harvard Business Review and, among others, or in particular, a book, Lead from the Future, How to Turn Visionary Thinking into Breakthrough Growth, published in 2020 in April. A book that we use now and that I'd like to talk with you about. And the first question we wonder is, okay, what is the essence for you from this book? And is there a specific occasion at which you realized, okay, we need this tool?
Thank you, Andreas, for the question. I'll start us off, and then obviously Josh will chime in as well. I mean, from my vantage point in the origination of the book and the thinking really came from the challenges we faced in breakthrough innovation, successfully making it through to fruition. The resource allocation process seemed to consistently break down, whether it was an impatience for the growth of the effort, resources being pulled back into the core, just not really giving the full commitment right from the beginning. There were factors that led to us realizing that it wasn't enough to have a committed innovation team. You needed a committed senior leadership team. And in order to have that happen, they needed to have a vision and a long-term strategy by which could wrap around the breakthrough innovation growth efforts to see them, to commit and to align and commit to the effort to see them through. So that's really where we came to realize that without a vision and strategy behind breakthrough innovation, without that reason, that purpose, that why behind the what and how, we weren't going to see the commitment, especially in large established corporations. And Lead from the Future was an ability to bring along the idea of future back thinking and planning that we found was different than traditional strategic planning, but was it critically important to have this approach in order to allow the innovation efforts that we were prescribing, whether that's disruptive innovation or business model innovation, to be successful.
So the second part of your question was when this kind of planning is most useful. And what I'd emphasize from what Mark said is that future back thinking and strategy planning needs to happen when you're in the midst of significant change. Right, so we contrast future back strategy with present forward strategy. And what most of us are taught to do, what most of us do intuitively, is look around, think about what our core strengths are, how we compete in the markets today, leverage our core competencies, et cetera, and try to do a better job of what we're already doing today, which is, of course, highly appropriate when things are relatively stable. But when you're in the midst of disruptive change, when there are significant uncertainties in the marketplace due to things like global pandemics, upsetting, generations of dogma about how our markets work and how consumer behaviors play out, then you actually need a very different approach, which is a lot more creative in nature and which starts with an agnostic view of the future, sets a vision for who and what you want to be in that future, and then ties it back to today. So it's a completely different starting point for competitive planning.
So what I also wondered beyond the contents of the book is that you published it in April this year, right? So apparently you wrote it before the onset of the COVID crisis, right? So kind of timing. And March, April here in Germany was the time when it really started off and we all had to stay at home. When you talk to executives now given the COVID crisis, does the thinking you have in your book, does it change or is it even more relevant? Or are there adaptations necessary? What is your view on that?
Well, I would say two parts of that. One is it's more relevant than ever, but we as human beings and as executives tend to become even more short-term oriented during a crisis. So it's a challenge. It's more important than ever, but the tyranny of the urgent, if you will, is further crowding out the ability to think in a future back or a long-term way. Why it's more important than ever is because you need a North Star for an organization. You need to be able to still set the direction that is going to be relevant and really enduring past the COVID crisis, that with a proper vision, more than just a vision statement, but actually looking at what's the future organization and how does it fit in a future environment well past COVID. That gives the organization a purpose-driven, hopeful, inspirational, a reason for being that helps, I think, further give hope as we're dealing with the crisis. But as we wrote in the book, whenever there's just a general tendencies as human nature to succumb to individual cognitive biases that tend to anchor us to the short term, and our rewards and incentive system tend to further that. And then, as you said, in a time of a crisis, it becomes even more of this short-term orientation. And yet we need to try to figure out, of course, we need to figure out plans in the medium term to address scenarios and the risk and uncertainty that we're going to face at least for another 12 months. But again, this planning and this way of thinking becomes actually more important than ever. And Josh and I have talked quite a bit about this in different forums, but Josh, I'm sure you'll have plenty to add to this.
In addition, is that we all have a sense that things are changing, irrecoverably throughout the crisis, right? We're all become accustomed to working on Zoom from home. Telemedicine has taken off. Consumer buying habits have changed. So much more has moved to digital and to online. We all have a sense that things are changing, and what we tell our clients, the companies that we work with, is that they need to think really carefully about where things will land, right? So what changes will stick, what won't, and what it means for their businesses, right? So trends that we've been seeing materialize over many, many years, and we're still sort of on the fringes of markets, are now all of a sudden front and center. Other things might be very specific to the last, to this COVID experience, and then are going to recede. No one has a crystal ball. We don't know exactly where all this is going to land, but companies need to be really deliberate about putting their assumptions on the table and placing bets, because the best positioned companies 2 or 3, 4 years from now are the ones who are moving pretty aggressively now to take advantage of changing market circumstances that haven't been fully baked in yet.
Thank you. We also do some executive education, and then we hear back from these executives. So, okay, you have a nice book with a lot of content. So, especially now in COVID crisis, my agenda is full of topics, right? So how do I squeeze it in? So for the troubleshooting COVID crisis managing executive, what are the 2 or 3 very operational things you would recommend he or she should start next week, given all resource time constraints executives typically face? Do you have one advice or 2 advice to start at least dealing with these topics?
Very practically, Andreas, given the cognitive biases that Mark described earlier, adjustment to a post-COVID world isn't going to happen on its own, right? We're all fighting fires every day, trying to deal with the immediate effects of the crisis. So one very practical thing we tell leaders to do is to simply carve out a small but protected amount of time as a leadership team to think carefully about what the future is going to hold. And that can be, a day a month, or 5 to 10% of their time, or create a SWAT team, with key leaders on it. But make sure you do it, right? So the structural import of carving off time is even more important in a time of consistent crises and constant urgencies like this one. So that's one thing I'd offer.
And then the other thing, I just add one other one other thought, which goes back to a bit of this paradox or tension. We have there's a story about a former prisoner of war in Vietnam who he was very senior. He was, I think, almost the rank of an admiral at the time, and he really led all the people who were in prison camps, through their own system to be able to do that. And basically, it became what was called the Stockdale paradox, which meant that you had to be realistic about the current circumstances, that you couldn't just say, oh, we're going to get out of prison camp next week. You had to be realistic about you were going to have to fight and face and endure. But you also needed hope, and you also needed to prescribe a vision about, kind of imagining being out of prison camp and back with your families. And I think this goes the same way here. So carving out the time to imagine the future, to think about what are the scenarios in the near term to address navigating through COVID is part of getting to work to navigate your way through this and to establish that North Star. And so you do have to be realistic. You have to deal with the day-to-day, but you also have to be continually encouraging the organization. And without spending that time that Josh says, you won't be able to be thinking those bigger ideas along with what seems like, never-ending day-to-day crises and challenges that don't necessarily, they're operational and execution oriented, but they're not necessarily creating an ability to provide inspiration for the organization.
And finally, when you mentioned it a little bit in your book, but okay, a company needs a strategy and a vision, but also an individual, right? So, and then being a student or graduate today probably also creates a lot of some headache for you, at least in some areas. So, do you have advice to apply this general rational thinking to the individual level, and have a vision for your career or so? Do you apply it to your own career, or do you have experience from this?
Josh, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a lot easier said than done. We recognize that, but at its essence, what we're talking about is taking the time to think carefully about your aspirations, right? So your aspirations as a company, your aspirations as an individual, who and what you want to be in the future, what the future is likely to hold, and how you can marry those things together, right? So how you can position yourself to do the kind of work that would be deeply meaningful to you, to fulfill your purpose, to be excited about how you're learning and growing over the course of a career. And we find it to be absolutely applicable. And we try to do it ourselves. We encourage our colleagues to do it and our clients to do it as well. Because what it's about is, as Mark said earlier, creating a vision that then stands in as a North Star for your life. And we don't know exactly what the route will be from today to that envisioned future. But if you have that North Star there and you can kind of continually come back to it, it makes it easier and makes it more feasible, as we kind of deal with the vicissitudes of life and crazy years like this one with unforeseen crises and all that, to make sure that we're constantly, being gravitationally pulled towards that North Star. So we do recommend that, as individuals, we take a little bit of time to figure out where we want to get to in our careers and in our lives. And then periodically, as we go through normal years and then challenging years like this one, check back in and assess your progress and see if there's any adjustments to make.
Thank you very much for these insights. I guess a nice compliment to when we present the tool in class. And I really highly appreciate that you took the time to talk to us, to me at least first, and then to hopefully love more people in this way. Yeah, and I wish you all the best for the crisis and the North Star to come afterwards. And
yes, thank you.
Thank you, Andreas.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good luck to you and your class as well.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Yep.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.